Good morning, and my name is Lacey Belova. I am super excited to have everybody with us today. We're going to be doing 3 activities today. We are going to be working on a few things, starting with looking at what gardens look like in the 18th century. We will then move on to a conversation with our horticulturist, Ryan, about drying your own herbs and pressing flowers, either ones from your garden, ones that you find out on a walk in the woods, or ones that you get in a bouquet from somebody else. So I want to get started with our Design Your Own Garden. You had an opportunity, if you wish to download the layout of our garden from our website here at Gunston Hall. Now this garden, this one I'm using is set on a magnetic board, and I'm going to stick some magnets to it today, but you can use whatever method you want. You also got all the little bits of the garden. Sorry, that's a little small. The camera is a little far away from me today so that I can do some activities later. But the little bits of the garden are representative objects of things that we are going to be planting in the garden. If you want to cut those out and use them on your own garden, you can. Or if you're interested in drawing on your garden and creating your own, labeling them, or just writing in the different spaces where those plants go, you're more than welcome to. So I'm going to spend a couple of moments designing my own garden, and I'll hold it up for you to see in just a minute. And we know that the garden at Gunston Hall was laid out in about an acre square. And within that acre, there were a lot of things going on. For one, it was fenced off. The fence was intended as a separation of space. There were lots of thresholds that people walked through during George Mason's lifetime to access different spaces on the property. And the gate on the garden happened to be one. There were only certain people who were invited or allowed into that space. They were either in there doing a job, as we know that the people who were enslaved who worked at Gunston Hall did. They were an invited guest, or they were a Mason family member. Individuals other than those typically weren't allowed in the garden. It was in some ways an extension of the space, the house at Gunston Hall. It's really fascinating and in some ways really sad to think about, because there was this massively beautiful space that many, many, many people at Gunston Hall did not have the opportunity to enjoy. Ryan, do you have any thoughts to add about the big garden at Gunston?
Well, like you're kind of organizing it, it's really going to be exciting for us to get going. And you can see there, now Lacey, are you following yeah, you are. So
I am following the design.
That design that you show, I think the biggest thing that's fascinating to me is just all of the geometry that's going on. It is so symmetrical, and there was such an emphasis in that time period on neat and clean lines, and each of the paths, each of the beds, and each of the beds within the beds contributed to that overall feel, and even the fence as well. And you see that reflected in the house. And so this whole area where geometry is kind of ruling the design and organizing.
Mm-hmm. And there were lots of different kinds of plants in there. This was not just a decorative garden. There was a lot going on in here. We believe, based on archaeology that we've done and studies of gardens that have survived, and studies of gardens in textbooks from the time period, that there were often things like vegetables and fruit being grown in these gardens, not just pretty flowers. That this garden here at Gunston Hall, we believe, was intended not only to provide a space of beauty and enjoyment, but it was also a space that provided sustenance for the family, the Mason family in particular. There were other gardens on the property that probably supported people who were enslaved and others who were spending their lives at Gunston Hall. So in my representation, we haven't labeled what some of these items are, but I've put things in here so far to represent some beautiful flowers right up near that central walk. I've also got the little skinny ones with the little squiggly lines on them are, in my mind, fruit trees. I've also got some berry bushes. I've got some vegetables, and way down here at the bottom, farthest away from the house, I've got what represent hot boxes or cold frames. And these were spaces that lots of gardens in the 18th century had, whether or not they were intended to produce food, because the hot boxes and the cold frames allowed for things to grow in a season which they might not naturally. So we're starting seeds, we're starting small plants in these spaces that are a little bit more protected from the elements. And there's a difference between a hot box and a cold frame. A cold frame provides a little bit of protection from the elements with the use of the sun, gets a little bit of extra heat and a little bit of extra warmth. But a hot box is dug out, filled with manure, typically cow or horse, as I understand it, which is somewhat composted, and that composting, the chemical reactions that are going on there, one of the byproducts is heat. So it helps keep those small plants warm and refreshed throughout the cold season. So I don't know if you have ideas, Ryan, about the kinds of things that might have been started in hot boxes. Do we have any thoughts or ideas about that at this point?
Yeah, definitely. They would be able to get in there surprisingly early, perhaps around.
Like in February, right?
Yeah, so kind of crazy that the manure would be that effective in keeping the space warm. And some of the first things to go in would have been cole crops, so your cabbages, broccoli, cauliflower, all of those things. And they're going to be transplanted probably around March, or maybe a little after. Another thing that's really interesting is that, today we have all these plastic or ceramic pots that we're using. In the cold frames, they had sort of like wicker-like baskets that they could move and then set into the garden that would allow, the roots not to be as disturbed, sort of like we do today. But the other thing, starting in March, then they might have been able to, instead of those cole crops, they would put in other things that like it warm. So maybe some of your squash, they might get a head start with peppers, those sorts of things. So it was a really versatile space that would be useful at the beginning and also a little bit at the end of the season.
Of course. Ryan, we have a question in the chat, and I want to address that. We have a question about how far the garden renovation project has progressed and what's complete at this point. And we don't, I'm sorry, Stacy, have templates available to show right now beyond this drawing that I have that we used to make the activity for today. And if we look at the drawing, let me hold it just a smidge closer. The fence around the outside of this garden, this is a rendering actually of what we were hoping to achieve. So the fence exists, it's complete. The gates are in. The majority of the pathways that you see within the garden, the big central path, the ones that go around the edge, and the ones that the one that crosses here, those are mostly complete. We currently have a cover crop in the beds right now. We have turnips. Ryan showed us one a couple of weeks ago. The roots are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, which is breaking up the soil and making it ready for us to be able to use it when we start planting, late July, August, Ryan?
Yeah, and if you all would like, I can show you that. I've had it drawing here.
Oh, how exciting.
It's a little bit scraggly up top now, but you see, this turnip was not very remarkable, quite small, even when it was fully hydrated. But this root,
it's so long.
It's about 2.5 feet long, and it gives you a sense of how valuable turnips can be in the garden. With all the construction, there's been a lot of heavy equipment passing over the space, and so the soils are fairly compacted. And that kind of root action that we're getting on our turnips is really helping to open things up, break things up, allow water to get in a little bit better. And when we till it under, it'll be adding a lot of organic matter and nutrients. So it's really cool what the turnips are doing.
And the last thing that we're working on in the garden is right here, the terracing. That's not quite complete yet. We are hoping that we will be able to open the garden to visitor access this summer when we reopen. but we're not entirely sure if we're going to be able to get that done. And we know that the terraces won't be complete when we reopen to the public. But they should be soon, Ryan, right? We're just not sure exactly when.
Yeah, we're hoping to be able to start getting in and working in the garden space at least early July.
Mhm.
But the terraces are a little bit tied up right now. They might be another month or a little bit longer. One thing we're all aware of right now is uncertainty, and so we're just kind of being ready to get in and do what we can when we're able to.
Yeah, I'm excited. We're hoping to get the boxwoods in July, August, and start doing.
August and September we'll be planting those.
That's right.
And that's going to be awesome because that's one of the things we know how it was laid out in the garden. We have really good documentation, and so we'll be putting in the boxwood tea. It is 1,210 little boxwood plants.
So many boxwoods.
Yep. And we'll be getting them in this fall.
And we're going to have, the intent at this point is that we're going to have staff planting them this summer. We aren't able to have volunteers back on site yet, but we're hoping that we'll be able to get staff that are socially distanced, planting these 1,000 some odd boxwoods this summer and early fall, so that in the late fall, you can come back to Gunston Hall and see what they look like once they're settled in.
And then long term, in the spring, that's when we're going to be making our big effort to get a lot of the other things, perennials, herbs, vegetables, the things that we think would have been there with the final installment of the bulbs coming in the fall of 2021.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ryan. Now, I completed what I was going to do with my garden. You guys could see it when I was holding up on screen. If anybody's willing to share theirs, hold theirs up on screen, we'd love to see it now, but if not, you can send your garden pictures to our historic@gunstonhall.org email account. If you are interested in sharing them with us now, you can turn your video on, hold it up to the screen if you've been working on it. We'd love to see it, but no worries if you don't. All right, looks like nobody wants to share right now, but that's totally fine. Like I said, you can send it to historic@gunstonhall.org, which I'm also putting in the chat right now. Oh, we had a question, another question about the terraces, Ryan. What will be planted on the terraces?
As in that time period, that will be grass. And it's going to be, I believe, Kentucky bluegrass. So we'll have a cool season grass out there. And in that time period, that's what we believe they were using, grasses. Mowed spaces were very remarkable and very much connected to the status that the garden communicated.
And this would have been something that, say, an enslaved person would have gone through with a scythe or a sickle and mowed the grass by hand every day. Or not every day, but frequently.
Yeah. And it would have been especially challenging is because the terraces, there's some pretty steep angles and curves, and so it was a very skilled process and took a lot of talent to do that work.
I can imagine. I watch our groundskeeper today. Before we started this process, I would watch him mow the hillside, which is really steep, and it was always terrifying because I was afraid that the mower would like roll down the hill because it's so steep. But you can imagine in the 18th century, if you ever get to come out and visit it and look at the terraces again, somebody standing on that hillside and doing it by hand, that's just mind-boggling. Well, if you have any other questions, do feel free to continue putting them in the chat. We're going to keep monitoring that. But we're going to head into our next activity, and I'm going to toss the supplies list up on screen. So if you are interested in following along with us, you can do that. So we'll pop that up on screen, give everybody a minute to get sorted out if they want to participate along with us, and then we'll come back in just a moment. Stacy, yeah, it's a really exciting year for the garden, and I am super looking forward to getting back on site. It was amazing watching it come together. Ryan just joined us in March, so he has come in right at the end of the process. But from start to finish, this has been such an amazing experience seeing this space come back to life. I'm super excited about seeing plants in there later this fall. All right, I think anybody who wishes to, if you downloaded the supplies list, you can also grab that. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to get started with our next section.
Okay. I was just going to ask as we get going, did anyone bring any herbs that they're planning on drying?
I've got some. I'm ready.
Okay. So I'm going to just throw up a kind of quick overview of the process here. And we're going to talk a little bit about just some of the things that you want to be aware of. So
hey, Ryan, you may want to put it in full screen mode.
That's what I was just going to ask. Okay, thank you.
Yep, there
So
you
this
go.
looks
Perfect.
like what we want, I think.
That's perfect. And then you'll need to scroll down rather than click through.
Perfect. And it's not covering up the picture. My
Nope,
Zoom.
you're good.
Good. Just wanted to make sure. So the key to good drying is air circulation. We're going to hit on that a little bit. But what I think is really interesting is all the steps that happened before. So you've got to actually grow the herbs, and that was something that a lot of people were doing in the 18th century. And I wrote here, plant your herbs in a pickle. We know that a lot of the herbs grown in this time period were grown in a mix of flowers and other things. And it's really interesting because we've learned since that, when herbs are stressed, they tend to have more flavors. And when they're grown next to certain plants, they also tend to have more flavor. And so that was happening. Maybe they weren't aware of it, but they were growing really flavorful herbs. Typically, you want to harvest just before flowering, and that's when most of the nutrients are in the leaves. Once flowers start setting, plants typically will pull a lot of the flavors out and into the flowers as they work on reproducing. So bundling is really important. You don't want to have a huge bundle, but you also don't want to make 1,000 bundles if you're putting up a lot. I'll show you guys in just a second, but typically when you have bigger leaved herbs like basil or sage, you might want smaller bundles, whereas like rosemary, parsley, maybe thyme or oregano, those things can have a little bit bigger bundles. You're going to hang your herbs in a well-ventilated area and keep them out of direct sunlight, and that's just because the UV is going to break down the compounds in them that give them their specific flavors. Once they're dry, you're going to want to put them in an airtight container, a Ziploc, or, what's the word? But what you might take your lunch in. Otherwise, mason jars with seals are fantastic.
You thinking about a Tupperware, Ryan?
Yes, thank you, Lacey.
Yeah.
The word escaped me. And some of you guys might be using a food dehydrator. We've done that in the past. It works really well. And if you use the lowest setting, you shouldn't be too hot, and it shouldn't harm the herb's flavor. So those are the keys, really. I'm going to kind of stop the screen share real quick, and we're going to check out how to make sure your size is correct.
Ryan, I have a question for you. Go ahead and stop your screen share.
Yeah.
This is my food dehydrator. It has one setting on.
Oh boy.
So I keep meaning to ask you this and I keep forgetting. So if I have a food dehydrator like this one that just has that one setting and it's not super hot, it's warm, but not hot, should I leave my herbs in there for that 24 to 48 hour time frame, or should I check on them more frequently and test them to see if they're ready?
That's a great question. I wonder if there's any way that you have the specs that tell you the temp, because if it's going to take them over, 115, then it might not be a great option.
For herbs in particular.
Yeah, exactly. So most things you can dry at a lot warmer temperatures, but once you start getting over 115, that's when a lot of the important flavors and aromas will break down, and you won't have as good a product. But I wouldn't
check.
hesitate to give it a try, just because it can be you know, a really good way to do it. And if you get where you need in 6 hours, then you could be doing a lot of herb drying.
Awesome. Good to know. Thank you.
Yeah. So I have here a little bit of rosemary, and this is probably, I was thinking, enough for 2 good bunches. And honestly, my favorite way to do it with rosemary is, where did I put my rubber band? Yeah, I've got one right here. Just to kind of band it. And what I thought about is, if you think about what you can put your hand around loosely, so about that kind of width, that's probably enough for 2. And so Lacey, that's definitely going to be a little too large, I would say.
So my parsley bundle I need to break up.
Yeah, that might work out to 2 or 3 even.
Okay. And I heard you say rubber band. So it's cool for me to bundle them up in rubber bands or string.
Rubber bands.
In the house.
String works great.
Okay.
What I found with the string is it's great if you just set it down on the table beforehand, put your herbs on top, and then it's really easy to bundle back up.
Makes
Otherwise,
sense.
maybe you put a little loop on it there, and then you can kind of come back and tighten it up as you like. Because one thing to remember too, if you've got a lot of herbs that are drying together, they're going to be a lot less tight when they're dry, and it could be nice to easily sort of cinch that up so they don't just all, you know, fall.
Sense. And be careful with your rubber bands. I just snapped one of mine on myself.
So before we get into talking a little bit about the historical herbs, does anyone have any questions about the process of drying? I'll show you guys one other thing that we've found to be useful here for our drying. Just to the right, you can use old bed frames. Just that sort of stuff provides a really great surface for drying off things. Closets are all right. Might not have the best airflow, but if you can think about good places, you will have good herbs. All right. I think I'm going to throw the screen share back up. We'll talk a little bit more. Okay. All right. So one thing that was really interesting, and Lacey, feel free to chime in on this one because I know you're much more familiar with the recipes of the time period, but herbs are typically listed just as sweet herbs. And so in a lot of recipes, it was really difficult to understand, well, okay, what was going into this? How much of this herb? Typically, they're just these collections of herbs. And so we see thyme, rosemary, basil, sage was also popular, parsley. And so all of these herbs were probably used, but used based on their the cooks and the people who they might have been cooking for's personal preferences as they were being prepared. Oh, Lacey, I think you're muted.
Thanks, Ryan. I didn't want to accidentally take over the screen from you.
No.
Yeah, when you're talking about sweet herbs, best understanding that we have is that typically they're talking about things like parsley, chervil, sage, marjoram, thyme. There are some that tend towards a little bit more savory flavors. The thyme, the rosemary, and the marjoram, those edge into those, and sometimes you'll see them specifically referenced. But there's differences depending on taste of the cook, taste of the family. So we have that difference of opinion that makes it really interesting sometimes to see what's going on.
Yeah. And I kind of just think it's fascinating, the sources that we have. It kind of reminds me of an old recipe that we found from my grandmother that lists $2 worth of liver. And so you just don't know how much of certain things would be going into things.
Yeah. While you're still talking, Ryan, I also want to point out, I don't have an old bed frame to use for hanging my herbs. So I've got some safety pins clipped onto an old hanger, and I'm going to use that and hang it either from a curtain rod or from a door frame in my kitchen.
Yeah, that's a perfect option. I forgot we did include hangers as part of our strategies. But yeah, herbs were used for loads and loads of different things, as well as other plant materials. We see here this recipe for a sage tea. And you've got just a lot of herbs that would have probably been grown in most people's gardens: sage, rue, mint, pennyroyal. And Lacey has told me that this tea produces a very similar mouthfeel to the teas that the English folks were more accustomed to.
Mhm. And Ryan, I remembered, you might remember a couple of days ago, I was like, I can't remember what Baum is,
Oh, yeah.
which is a very German oriented word. It's balm. It's probably lemon balm or bee balm.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's great. Those things all just smell so good. I'm looking forward to when we have some at Gunston Hall and we can, go through and test some of these things out.
Absolutely.
And I also included these two images here just to kind of give us a sense of some of the books that were around in this time period. We'll be looking at a lot of herbals. And here we see poppy, and then underneath you get C, D, E, F, and these uses just kind of went on and on. And in this particular herbal, there are over 1,000 entries. And so there's this just really great depth of knowledge in how herbs were used in this time period. And maybe not all of the uses were as good as we might think today, but folks were certainly thinking and using herbs for a variety of things.
Ryan, I want to pause you for just a second. We've had some new folks join us. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just to catch everyone up, we are in the middle of talking about herbs, their uses, and how to dry them as they were used in the 18th century. We're talking a little bit right now about recipes and diagrams that we know exist.
Yeah. And so other uses might be, you might distill things, and that was one way they made rose water, which was a very common flavoring. So a lot of just things that made their cooking better, tinctures for healing. Herbs were really used for quite a bit of things.
Absolutely. And the recipes and things that we're seeing up on the screen right now reference Western European uses in the 18th century. During George Mason's lifetime, these things also would have been used by people enslaved at Gunston Hall, who might have been using sage and the balms and the mints as substitutes for plants and remedies that they had at home back in Africa. There's much less reference to those remedies that we have today. There are some that appear in recipe books and in books like Gerard's Herbal that Ryan has up on screen right now, but they're few and far between.
Yeah, and one of the things that's kind of interesting about that, we've trying to learn more about that. A lot of the knowledge is still exists in folk knowledge, and so anthropologists and ethnographers have had a lot of conversations to try and help flesh out what those folks knew, and all of the stuff that we might not be able to access because the historical record just isn't very strong.
Yeah.
Did want to move on just a tiny bit here. So herbs were part of this seasonal food system that folks in the 18th century were very well aware of. And so these herbs obviously are being dried in the summer and providing valuable flavors in the fall, winter, and really year round. They would have probably tried to put up as much as they could have. Wanted to highlight those some of the other things that were going on. We know a lot of foods were being preserved, whether in sugar, vinegar, other foods that might have been able to be dried were. There's also a lot of emphasis on storage crops. So pumpkins, those sorts of things, winter squash, those things could be kept quite late into the season. And English folks, at least, they really were invested in their salads. And it kind of fits into their ideas of good health in this time period. So spinach would have been something that they would have had quite late into the season. Other crops like potatoes, sweet potatoes, those are going to be set up to cure and kept underneath and in the cellar. A lot of those other root crops as well. They, of course, have access to staples, corn and wheat, but they would have been able to access dried beans if they were saving those. And the other part about this, I have a picture here of cabbage. We learn and know that cabbage was perhaps the most popular vegetable grown in the colonies because it's really resilient to heat, and it is also quite reliable in the cold. And so a lot of times folks were finding that they planted their spinach and lettuce too late, They planted it too early and it bolted. So there were a lot of issues with adapting things that worked really well in England to things that worked really well in Virginia. So cabbage was one of the mainstays.
Speaking of some of the save crops that could be saved, we also know that people who were enslaved in Virginia were growing things like sweet potatoes, which you see in the image on the left. But they're also growing things like cowpeas and sorghum, millet, a variety of other grains and goods to supplement the foods that they were being supplied with by their owners, which were often very insufficient. And they relied very heavily on their gardens to fulfill their nutritional needs by growing some of these other things that they could save and keep.
Now, I think, Lacey, was there any other things we were hoping to talk about with regards to?
I can't think of anything at this point.
Okay. Well, with that then, unless anyone has any questions, we were thinking to change gears and start looking at flower pressing.
It's an exciting one. This one may take us a little bit longer.
Okay. Well, perfect. I think we've got.
Oh, hang tight. Give me a sec, Ryan. Let me pop up. I'm gonna steal the screen from you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Because we are going to put our
what we need
of supplies on the screen. Oops, there it is. So we'll give everybody just a moment to go ahead and if you wish to participate along with us to get some of these things if you haven't prepared them already. All right, let's head into that next activity. We're going to be pressing flowers. So Ryan, go ahead and get us started.
Okay. So today I kind of went for a little walk just around the neighborhood. I found quite a few things, little clovers, and I think what I'm most excited about are these bigger, what I believe is sort of like a wild carrot. And then from our home, we had just a few down there.
Nice.
We're going to give a try too. So much like herbs, we setting this up here. Okay. Much like herbs, a lot has to do with airflow and how fast you can dry those flowers out. And so the big principle is that airflow is a lot more important than the weight. So let me go back, I guess, okay, there we are. So if you're using, a more traditional press like this, you don't need to have it sort of cinched down all the way. You want there to be good pressure, but too much pressure will prevent that airflow and cause a lot of what you're using to rot. The other strategy that we're going to look into is how you might put some old textbooks back into action. And
I've got mine with my cardboard already.
Excellent. And corrugated cardboard is very important. There's other kinds, but we definitely want that openness to it that kind of really works as a wick and pulls the moisture out of the flowers that you might want to press.
Now, Ryan, I just thought of something. Can we reuse the same pieces of cardboard again and again and again, or do we have to replace them each time we're pressing flowers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually you can get quite a few uses out of them. You'll see that over time, there's little depressions and flowers will start to stick.
Gotcha.
When you have a lot of those, you probably want to replace, but I usually I've been getting at least, dozens of goes out of them. The key is to really make sure that they're really dried out before you try to remove them. I think they get stuck a little bit more when there's still a little bit of moisture in them. Now, a lot of folks.
Oh, how do you know when they're dry?
That's a great question. Usually the best way to know is if you open it up and you pick it up and your flower is sort of flat but flimsy, that's a good indication that it needs to dry a little bit more. Good sort of, let me grab an example here. They're underneath, but yeah, so your thing should stand pretty, sturdy, upright.
Got it.
And when you're done, you can get pretty vivid colors with this type of
that's awesome
technique. And so even if you don't have a traditional press, the books that we have, we demoed in it, and it does work really well. So just a couple things though about it that are things to be mindful of. Smaller flowers are always going to dry a little bit faster, and that may help them dry a little bit better. More fibrous ones tend to do better than ones that are really like wet or weep a little bit when you pick them, or if they feel waxy. Those things I haven't had a lot of luck with. If you're using a larger flower, kind of like those false carrots I showed you, you want to give them a little bit of extra space, and that might be the only one you put in that level. We do recommend using a fan, just for all of those reasons we talked about, airflow, and then just kind of be ready for trial and error. Some flowers just do not work very well, and it can be a little bit unpredictable, but that's part of the fun of it, I guess. You open it up and there's this really cool thing you find. Last year I was doing a lot of zinnias, and it went in kind of green and it came out just bright red.
That's so cool.
Variety, yeah. So this is an example of a really well-spaced setup. This one dried great, whereas, if they're a lot closer, they might not dry as well, and then you get rot, lose color.
And on this screen, we're looking at the purple clovers on the left.
Yeah,
The
those
ones on the right are still fairly well spaced.
Yeah. Sorry, I guess the other one there is the same.
That's okay. I was just confirming for everybody.
Yep. And if you have bigger things, you don't put as many on your press. Smaller things, you can definitely include a lot more flowers. And we got a little bit of the jewelweed there. Those actually came out really nicely. We kind of saw them on our image. Does anyone have any questions though about the process overall? And this is what the makeshift press looks like when it's in action.
Feel free to take your time, type them in the chat. We're watching that. And if you have questions you'd like to ask us out loud, if you hover over your name, there's an option for you to raise your hand. We have a request to show the pressed flowers again, Ryan.
Okay, let me stop the share.
Those are beautiful. And that jewelweed is the one in the middle left, yeah?
Get that extra close. And so these, we a couple of them, actually this one here was collected at Gunston Hall.
I was gonna say, is that the lantana out of the courtyard at Gunston?
And then the others though, were just a quick walk through the wooded areas by the VRE. So there's a lot of cool stuff happening. So I see here we have a question that's kind of leading us into our historical content.
That is a great one.
Let me see though, I just did want to show one other thing here. So if you end up picking and you realize you picked way too many flowers, you can dry them, much like we talked about with our herbs. And these also were picked at Gunston Hall. We have some, the lantana again, and then the,
oak leaf hydrangea.
Hydrangea, thank you. So it dries really great and just very pleasant to look at. So
before we get to our historical content, Ryan, I have two questions. One is that the one that's upside down fell a little. Is that thing for my fennel, or do I need to space them a little bit more?
I think those should work out all right.
Okay.
I'm basing that off of, I think the fennel will dry fairly quickly, and those leaves are really wispy. So
yeah,
that's
and
the
then
hope.
Second question. I was given some hydrangeas, not the beautiful oak leaf hydrangeas that you picked from Gunston Hall, although these were beautiful too, but they've wilted.
Mm-hmm. See, I think I would give them a try, but
yeah. You don't think that drying them like a bouquet would work better?
That might be the case. I'm not sure about the coloration there. I know hydrangeas change their color as a result of soil acidity. And I wonder if when they dry, they keep that, or if they will lose it.
We'll test it and we'll find out.
Yeah, no, because everything works out a little bit differently, every flower.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's get into kind of some of the history here. I'm gonna bring up my share screen again. So a lot of drying flowers in this time period, at least, has a lot to do with the ideas of science and leisure. And gardening as well is very closely associated with this. Granted, actually pressing flowers, it is very popular in the later 19th century with the Victorians, but in this time period, it is still utilized. So here we have a couple images that I kind of wanted to share with everyone that kind of capture the science and leisure aspects of gardening. This here is from one of the gardening manuals, and it kind of gives us a good representation of all of the math that's going on, the geometry and some of the symmetry that I mentioned earlier that is often used in laying out these gardens. And so gardening, science, they're very closely connected.
Ryan, just to clarify, we're looking at the one that says part 1 of geometry
Yeah.
at the top.
Yep. So you can see here to find a third proportional to 2 given, and all of these things between 2 given lines, to draw a tangent. So these are all very like elaborate and sophisticated ways for putting your garden together. Did you have a comment, Lacey?
No, go ahead.
Okay. But it's also leisurely. And so over here, I have this image. It says the florist, or an extensive and curious collection of flowers for the imitation of young ladies, either in drawing or in needlework. And so that might have been a popular pastime, certainly among folks with higher means. All of this elaborate thought is going on within the planter class, folks like George Mason and their families. Whereas, yeah.
I do have an 18th century example of that. There's a woman named Anna Maria Garthwaite. She's British, she's not American, but she was of the upper class, and she made a name for herself and probably quite a bit of money, although I haven't been able to validate that part, designing fabric based on drawings that she made of her own garden and plants that she had access to that were being imported from other parts of the world.
And that's such a cool example, and it captures a lot of the elements that are going on here. The transfer of plants from different parts of the world, and the use of the drawings. I think, yeah, so if we go back really quick, a lot of this herbal right here, Curious Herbal, was drawn. Most of the drawings were done by Elizabeth Blackwell. So you can kind of see how that leisure activity of drawing was used to produce these books. But the other really popular thing, I wouldn't even say popular, it's just on everyone's minds, is the science connections. And so the Bartram family, they live in Philadelphia and begin one of the first nurseries in the United States, well, in the colonial United States. And we see here a replica of some of the specimens that John Bartram collected in 1742. And people are really interested in new varieties, bringing varieties different places, and then kind of cultivating in their gardens these sort of hodgepodges from all over the world.
And hang on, go back to Bartram for just a second.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. But
He is also really fascinating. We believe that when George Mason was in in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he took a visit to Bartram's gardens. And we know that Bartram was transferring specimens of native plants all across the 13 colonies. And it's possible that George Mason was one of the people who received things or perhaps provided specimens for Bartram. We know for certain that George Washington was trading goods with Bartram. So just up the street, and Mason and Washington were fairly closely connected in that time period.
Yeah, and just this morning I was looking at one of Washington's letters, just looking at Bartram's catalog, and it is 9 pages, and there's probably I think there were well over 100 entries.
Oh my gosh.
So it was truly an extensive collection of plants that they were growing just outside of Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. And it seems, go ahead, Ryan.
Okay, yeah.
Seems minuscule in comparison to what we see in seed catalogs and shoots today, but in a time period when they aren't able to rely on the extensive greenhouses, mechanized watering, that in Philadelphia, this is likely being done in large part by paid labor. And here in Virginia, the growing of these kinds of things is being done by people who were enslaved. It's boggling the amount of labor that would have had to go into making these things happen in George Mason's lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. So right here is kind of unpack a little bit this idea that this was a very leisurely activity, and it really was that leisure that sort of signified one's entry into the planter class, the sort of gentlemanly pursuits of architecture, laying out your garden. Here we see from that florist just how you would practice your drawings. And there are a number of these entries over here on the left, but George Washington and George Mason are engaging in an almost constant exchange of different cuttings, different seeds, and they're going back and forth, and it's all sort of written down. And I picked this one especially because while we know they were very interested in growing vegetables, the garden actually is like over 3/4 devoted to vegetables. There is this very remarkable investment that they have in just these ornamental crops that were just grown because they liked them, they look nice, and they kind of signify their ability to have time and think about them, that status component. So here we see that some Persian jessamine and Gilder rose were sent, and these are actually things that we will be putting into our garden in the coming year.
Ryan, is jessamine jasmine?
Yeah, I believe so.
Awesome. And
Actually,
I've seen.
excuse me, it's actually a lilac, I think.
Oh,
Yeah.
So excited. I love lilacs. They're one of my favorites.
Yep. But then there's this sort of scientific aspect. The Enlightenment is going on. Linnaeus has just established his process for, sorry.
Back up just a second.
Yep.
Linnaeus is a really cool figure, but not everybody may know who he is.
That's fair.
His name is Carl Linnaeus. He was Dutch, Swedish?
I believe Swedish.
Northern European.
There we are.
And he laid out the system for scientific naming as it first came into being, and how Latin naming of plants in particular happens. So the system that we still use today is based on the Linnaean system that he developed in the 18th century.
Yep. Thanks, Lacey. Sorry about that.
Just good to know.
No, yeah, it's so easy to kind of jump around because I get quite excited about these things.
I can tell, and it's awesome.
So, but this idea, there were these folks, and I think the term that it is applied to them in this time period, we call them naturalists, and they kind of were traveling the country, traveling the world actually, and looking for unique specimens. And this is kind of where we get this direct connection that they're producing these presses. And again, we have a replica from John Bartram. They're producing a lot of sketches where the same work that this pawpaw sketch came in, there's sketches of American wildlife, so fish, turtles, birds, all sorts of things. And these are sort of the forerunners to the other well-known American naturalist, John J. Audubon. So that's all happening. And Lacey, you kind of told the story really well about Mason's meeting with the Bartram family up in Philadelphia. So I won't dwell on that too much longer. But here in this last slide that I wanted to
Sorry, Ryan, I forgot you were going to talk about it.
We want to make sure that we talk about that story because it is really cool. It seems that at least in one of the books that it's called, The Founding Gardeners, the author tries to argue that visit had an important role in sort of bringing these people together and getting them to think about nationhood and possibly changing some of the votes in the Constitutional Convention. So it's just a really awesome chapter in history, and cool to think that George Mason was there.
Good book. It's a really good and fairly easy read too.
Yeah, that's right. But back to that idea that plants and things are just going really everywhere, moving from found in one part of the world, move to another. Can it work? Can it be a commercial crop? Is it just an ornamental that we can grow in these elaborate garden spaces? Lewis and Clark's expedition is a great example of this. They're explicitly told to document a lot of usable plants, and they do use presses to do that and send many of them back to Thomas Jefferson, who's commissioned the expedition. But I wanted to highlight that many other European nations are engaging in this process at the same time. So we have on the right here these two works, one exploring species in the interior parts of Africa. The next one over here, the coast of Coromandel, that's in New Zealand. And so Europe is really going everywhere and trying to find all of these unique varieties and bringing them back to their gardens. There's state-sponsored herbariums, the Royal Botanical Societies. And so it's really much in fashion and seen as very important to building a powerful nation state.
Yeah, the thing that's important to remember as we're thinking about this, though, is also that in many ways, these sorts of explorations are fueled by slavery. And the fact that Mason was able to go up to Pennsylvania and explore Bartram's Gardens and perhaps bring some things back was reliant on the fact that he did enslave people. And a lot of the explorations of the interior parts of Africa happened because of the slave trade. And as they are looking in, they're looking at new places to be sending people new places to explore. We get the Western European inhabitations of the Coromandel Coast and other parts of the world in that area, Australia, for example. But this is all, it's really hard to separate them, but because of these things, we do have really amazing samples from Lewis and Clark's expeditions. We have things like John Bartram's Garden, and we still know about it. And we have this beautiful garden that we are really excited about opening and talking about at Gunston Hall.
Yeah, and I can kind of even add to that. I mean, we are still kind of engaging in this ongoing conversation of who benefits when you're bringing plants from one community to another, especially even with some of the seed banks that we're establishing around the world to protect biodiversity. And so the conversation continues, and it was going on or it has been going on for hundreds of years, which I think is really kind of fascinating.
Yeah, everything old is new again.
That's right.
In some ways. Although I hope not everything. There are some things from the past that I don't think that we should bring forward, personally. But we've got really exciting things coming up at Gunston Hall. If anybody has any final questions, feel free to type them into the chat. We're just about to wrap up our session today. Holly, Courtney, Ryan, and I will be hanging around to answer more questions if anybody has them. But I do also want to let you know about what's going on at Gunston Hall in the next few weeks. If you are on our mailing list, you may have heard that the grounds open back up starting next Friday, July the 3rd for the holiday weekend. This is a contactless experience. The grounds are the only thing that's open. There will not be indoor spaces open with the exception of 2 restrooms in the visitor center, which you access via the side. In August, we will be fully opening our buildings back up again and starting to do tours of the grounds and the mansion. And we will be continuing our virtual summer Saturdays for the next several weeks as we go through July and August. We've got great things coming up. Next week, we'll be talking about how they celebrated the 4th of July in the 18th century and other things that people did to show their patriotism. In a few weeks, we will also be talking about food again. We're going to be talking about gardening again later in August. We'll be getting a chance to check in with our archaeologist, Dave, in a few weeks. And of course, we'll be doing 18th century games as we get later in the summer. So thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time and we look forward to having you back with us. Thanks so much.